Suswagatam, me, Sanjeev Chevde, on behalf of all our colleagues at the Vivant UntamedEarth Foundation, I extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you to the webinar today on a very important topic of groundwater. It will be delivered by a gentleman who's been working in this field for a number of years. More about Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni just a little late. Before we actually get started, just a few instructions. एक तर तुम्हा सगळ्यांना भेटून खूप बरं वाटतंय. We are happy with your response. A few instructions is please keep yourself on the mute. The program flow is after a brief introduction of Vivant. We'll go to a formal introduction of Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, then the actual presentation, followed by question and answer session. You are requested to put your questions in the chat. Hopefully, Dr. Kulkarni will be able to address those questions. If for a variety of reasons it is really not possible, we'll try and get back to you via your emails. We request each and every one of you to use your actual names and no abbreviations, please. That will be a great help. Thank you so much. And well, there we are. So like I said, we welcome you as valued friends of the UntamedEarth. And with every program, we see this family growing. We hope to see you and have you with us on this journey of conservation together. Vivant UntamedEarth Foundation is a Mumbai-based organization which is working towards the conservation of our biodiversity and environment. Our premises are very simple. It is the respect, acceptance of biodiversity and its equal rights on our planet. Embracing environment-friendly lifestyle and use and development of environment-friendly technology. And this is what we feel is the most important guardians of this biodiversity heritage for our future generations. We have a lot of paths towards these objectives, both in the urban as well as the rural context, via lectures, presentations, exhibitions, field trails, nature clubs, workshops, and projects. We believe that awareness is 90% solution and education is the key. Our focus is the individual, and we believe in learning, sharing, evolving, and most importantly, changing into environmentally sensitized individuals. We believe in the power of the individual and therefore collective power of the community. We began with the webinars that we started dealt with what we feel have been very important and relevant topics. Indigenous seeds with bias, followed by water footprint of urban lifestyles, and in continuation, groundwater. Always talk about something to fill in the blanks, what we call as since we met last. The kind of activities that we've been involved in. Somebody will need to mute. And the lockdown gave us a beautiful opportunity for our neighborhood in a very different kind of way. The lockdown meant that there were no visitors. The rains meant that there was an abundant growth. And that is probably the wildflowers blossomed in our neighborhood. And here's a small little clip which I would like to share with you. Please mute yourselves. These were the beauties that we discovered in our neighborhood. All the gardens and the enclosed spaces had absolutely no visitors. And that's where we found some wonderful wildflowers right in our neighborhood. Though we've been exploring our neighborhood almost routinely on our walks and in search of our local biodiversity, we had not come across such wildflowers. Has the screen share gone?
No, we are able to see.
Yeah. You're able to see?
The image is not moving now.
Is it moving now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Good. And discovery of one wildflower led to something more. That's how we decided to explore more and more. And what we found was that there was a treasure here, which was absolutely lost in the routine circumstances. The few days of exploration would bring out new discoveries, which routine maintenance, mowing, cutting, pruning would have meant that we would never have ever seen them. While such flowers can be something as a routine in our natural areas like Kars or any other place or any other plateaus, just as you leave the civilization, finding them right in our urban midst was a great revelation. And we decided to explore more and document. And each was more fascinating than the one that we discovered. And of course, along with this wonderful floral diversity, it was also a pleasure and a treat to explore the microflora and the microfauna together. we decided to retain all the sounds of our urban chaos and the traffic. This will give you an idea about how these wildflowers have blossomed in the most unexpected places. This is what I was talking about. We hope that at least our public spaces and gardens can find some spot to accommodate these beauties. And we'll be very happy to hear your thoughts. You can share them on TheUntamedEarth@gmail.com. Thank you for being with us this beautiful Sunday morning. Do connect with us on Facebook and stay with us in this journey of conservation together. Thank you so much. I have stopped sharing the screen. Dr. Kulkarni and Kirti, after a very formal introduction of Dr. Kulkarni, I think we can get started with this session. I have specifically requested Kirti Vani for a formal introduction of Dr. Kulkarni. Kirti Vani is a master's with environmental sciences and an integral to the Untamed Earth right from its inception. We are fortunate to have some wonderful colleagues, and it is solely because of such individuals. I can name the Tillus, the Kishore Thakur, amongst others, and that is precisely the reason, and of course, well-wishers like all of you, that is precisely the reason why the Untamed Earth has come so far, and we hope to go further and farther with all of you. Kirti, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shevde, for this beautiful journey through the wildflowers in an urban area. And a very good morning to all of you. And I welcome you all to this webinar series organized by Untamed Earth. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Himanshu, who is going to talk us about groundwater and its importance today. Dr. Himanshu is a founder, trustee, and executive director of ACWADAM, that is Advanced Center for Water Resources Development and Management, situated in Pune. ACWADAM is a not-for-profit knowledge institution and a think tank working on groundwater since 1998. Dr. Himanshu is a hydrogeologist by qualification with a PhD from Pune University. He leads ACWADAM and has been working on aquifers and groundwater across India's diverse groundwater typologies for more than 35 years. He has been a CSIR research scholar and UNESCO scholar and a Fulbright fellow. At ACWADAM, he has established the principle of bringing communities closer to their aquifers and managing groundwater as a common pool resource. This is the process of aquifer-based participatory groundwater management. And he has steered up the concept of hydrogeology-based springshed management that has now become very important from local to national levels in India and its neighboring regions. For doing this work, ACWADAM has been done partnership with various organizations across India and its neighboring countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Vietnam, and has also begun work in Africa. Dr. Himanshu also works in the field of academics as a faculty and a course advisor at Shivnadar University and Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He has held many advisory positions on various committees of government, and he is currently also a member of the committee that is drafting India's new national water policy. He has also anchored several international action research projects in the subject of groundwater. And I would like to add here that ACWADAM also conducts very informative courses on groundwater management with hands-on training. And I recently did their online course titled Foundation Training Course on Groundwater Management. It is very well designed and well delivered course, which benefited me a lot as I'm working in the field of river rejuvenation. So it was a very interactive course that benefited me. And I would like you all to visit their website and to know more about their work in the field of groundwater. And now I request Dr. Himanshu to start with his talk.
I thought Mr. Rao was going to speak briefly first, right?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
We can do that. I think that's wonderful. We welcome you, Mr. Rao, all the way from Sydney. We just have a small request to keep it very relevant and as brief as you possibly can, so that becomes a very beautiful opening sequence for Dr. Kulkarni to follow and build upon. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak. Before Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, he is a veteran expert in groundwater, and I have no such any high profile in groundwater or the subject matter, but my personal experience I can share you. If you permit me, this is regarding the tribals, how they conserve water and recharge their dried up tube wells. And you, as I informed Mr. Sanjeev ji, in early 90s there was a world famous drought in Palamu district of then Bihar, now it is in Jharkhand. And the district collector was appointed to solve that problem, what happens to be my good friend. He took me there and he said कि राव first problem है कि यहाँ का जो drought को permanently cure करना है. Let us go around. That was from Palamu. That was a separate district. Garhwa was carved out, where it was the epicenter of drought. He took me around that small subdivision, and that LRDC, the Land Revenue District Collector, Land Revenue, the Amin and his survey maps, all were there with us. And we identified nearly 32 spots where a small check dams can be constructed. At that time, there was no NREGA. At that time, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana. So we roped in District Development Commissioner and diverted all Jawahar Rozgar Yojana funds to create check dams, and 32 check dams were created. They were such a large that the district fishery department came. They said, please hand over this check dam. We want to develop fishery here.
Oh, okay.
And I think after 90, there is no drought in the Palamu district till date. And most of the tube wells which were dried up in the villages, they all got recharged. In Delhi, there is a total ban on borewell. You cannot dig a borewell in Delhi. Here, I wanted to share something. In Gaya district, like you all know about the mountain man who carved the mountain to cut way for his bullock cart. in Gaya district, one tribal has cut continuously for 30 years to divert the rainwater going into the river and coming into their parched land. So it is all individual efforts. Now in Australia, I sent my email to Mr. Sanjeev ji.
Uh-huh.
They call it permaculture.
Okay.
They call it permaculture, where I don't like the word wasteland. It is a wasted land. It is not a wasteland. Land cannot be a wasteland. We have wasted that land by ignoring that as a wasteland. Here in Astini, they call it permaculture, which has come to India also. And in Telangana, which is a very plateau, is a rocky plateau, there is no grass grows there. It is a fully rocky and a red earth. Now people are converting that into a forest by applying this permaculture technique.
Yes.
And similarly, right now, just before this is start of the webinar, I got a call from Dubai. And I think Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni must be knowing Al-Baida project. Al-Baida project is also the same, which they are constructing swells like the trenches to catch the rainwater, create a water reservoir, and green up the entire area. And that is also charging the groundwater.
Thank you, Mr. Rao, and thanks to Vivant, UntamedEarth Foundation, and especially to doctors, both Mr. and Mrs. Shevde, for inviting me to this webinar. Without more ado, and good morning, dear friends. I also have some of my colleagues in this webinar. So while I speak, you can keep putting your questions in the chat box, and many of those might get answered in the chat box itself, because my colleagues are also here and I've requested them to address as many as possible, but we'll of course take a few questions at the end. So I will begin by sharing my going on. Therefore, with that sort of global background, this is more sort of realistic, and this is something you will relate to. More than half the world's population is dependent on groundwater today. So going from extremely tribal dominated pockets of India, like Shivpuri, for example, and even places like Palamu that Mr. Rao was referring to the central highlands of Vietnam, which looked at, which actually saw that great war, sort of Vietnam War a few decades back, to the developed world, say Montpellier in France, so a very old water supply system, to sort of the parched regions of Marathwada, and then a picture from Tumkur in Karnataka. And I could put in at least scores or hundreds of such pictures from the work that I've been involved in over the last 30, 35 years, and ACWADAM's own work in the last 22 years. Now, if you actually look at some very interesting statistics that are coming out of global literature, you see that almost 1,000 cubic kilometers of groundwater is extracted every year globally. That's the annual footprint of groundwater, the global footprint of groundwater. Out of that, 70% of this extraction is used in agriculture, of which 50% is in Asia alone. And as you can see here, this is the dominant color, or sort of the dominant section of the graphic. So agriculture in Asia takes up a large amount of groundwater extraction, and almost 70% of that is in Asia alone. And that's the reason why you see a concentration of the groundwater hotspots in the earlier slide. Now let me sort of begin the India story with something that many of you will agree with, and many of you have seen. So what does the crisis on the ground? So let me also state that most of the videos I will show you, there are about 3 or 4, are part of a longer film on groundwater, which also we will provide access to through Kirti. Maybe Kirti has a link to that. So I'll request Kirti also to provide access to people who have registered. Or if you write to us, we can provide you that film. It's a longish film. So all these videos have been clipped out of that film just for the sake of this presentation. Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Mates. Mates. Oh.
ये सर गया वर्ष खुदवाया, जनवरी में खुदवाया। 3 फीट पानी चढ़ जाता, अभी दिन भर में शाम को साफ हो जाएगा। फिर रात में जो इकट्ठा होगा सुबह 7 बजे से चालू हो जाएगा तो 11 बजे तक कोटी यहाँ चलेगी, दिन भर चलेगी। ये सर 30 दिन से ज़्यादा समस्या खराब है। हमारे दोनों भाई के पास पानी है, बाकी के लोग उनके पास पानी नहीं है। उस मोहल्ले में भी 2 घर पानी है, बाकी के घर पानी नहीं है, पूरा सुखद पड़ा है। बोर हो गया उस मोहल्ले में, 5-6 बोर से ऊपर हो गया, और इस मोहल्ले में 8-9 बोर इस मोहल्ले में भी है। यहाँ से रोड से उधर तक कोई में पानी नहीं है, और सरकारी लगा हुआ होल उसमें भी पानी नहीं है। कोरा खट मोटर छोड़ दी कोरे में। हम इतने बड़े हो गए, मेरी 30-32 साल की उम्र हो गई, मैंने ऐसी समस्या नहीं देखी थी।
So that's the crisis on the ground. Another evidence of this crisis, and this could be any village. I've actually removed the name of the village. But if you actually look at the crisis and if you convert that to some sort of an economic stress, then you find evidence of 3 kinds. First is the increasing cost for functional source or functional borewell, especially borewells. Second is the capacity of the pump that simply goes on increasing as you need to pull out water from deeper and greater depths. Now, in this particular village, 172 borewells were drilled in 5 years. The cost of this drilling amounted to 1.27 crore rupees. 35% of these borewells failed at the time of drilling itself, which means nearly 44 lakhs was spent on failed borewells. Now, if this 44 lakhs, for instance, therefore the question is, if this 44 lakhs, for instance, was used on more productive means of groundwater conservation and groundwater usage, what would that have meant, both in terms of social, economic, and ecologic distress, in terms of addressing all kinds of distress? And I think that's the fundamental question on which we can begin this conversation. Now, let's jump to the urban space. And in the urban space, as we have seen in many towns and cities of India over the last few decades, the problem really is about the growing gap between how much water we use as a city grows and how much can be supplied through formal means. So the gap between supply and usage keeps growing. And in order to fill this gap, you need water. And where does the water come from? Obviously from groundwater. And I think as India urbanizes, the importance of groundwater will become more and more greater and greater as people go in search of filling the gap between supplies and demand in urban India. Let's take a look at, with that background, let's take a look at what was India, say, thousands of years ago. And it's extremely relevant today because as the clamor for river revival, river rejuvenation, rivers grows, and as our legacy of being a river valley civilization also grows, we tend to forget that India was as much a groundwater civilization as a river valley civilization. Maybe part of the river valley civilization was a groundwater civilization, which can be evidenced from many archaeological sites. So for example, this picture is from Dholavira in Kutch. And this is a well that dates back nearly 4,000 years. So in the Harappan period. So interestingly, even at a global scale, and we've done, I've been part of some research on that as well, that the legacy of groundwater usage until the 19th century globally, and therefore also in India, was around two very clear tenets. First was, this is a very old 350-year-old spring up in the Himalayan region. And I'm also going to show you another picture of a rahet, which is supposedly more than 200 years old. And therefore, these two examples almost symbolize the use of groundwater until the 19th century, from maybe time immemorial. And what was that legacy? That legacy was groundwater access was very widespread, but was from shallow sources, which were normally common sources, community sources, springs, wells, canards in Iran, crises in Afghanistan. And the extraction was either with human power or animal power, where pulleys, gears, all sorts of engineering mechanisms were used. So it's not as if there was no technology for extraction. But mind you, access was community access, it was common access. Water was perceived as a common good. Now, between the, after the 19th century till now, something happened. And I'm going to try and capture that through this video, which talks about India's unique groundwater story post-independence, normally post-independence. And it's written about by many people, but we've tried to capture this in this little video through cartoons.
India's groundwater story is quite unique. India extracts almost a quarter of the global extraction of groundwater. And what makes this story unique is the fact that India was not such a groundwater dependent country even at the time of independence. When India became independent, our vision of water management was about dams and constructing dams and canals in order to take water to people. But I believe that didn't happen for various reasons. And therefore the last mile connectivity, the last mile delivery of water wasn't achieved for many years. So the gap was actually filled by groundwater. Subsequently in the 1950s and 60s, as the push for green revolution in terms of achieving food security increased, technology kicked in. And in the hard rock areas of India, for example, the borewell technology came. Droughts were also a factor or a stimulus for technology. For instance, the 1971-72 drought in Maharashtra and in large parts of western and southern India prompted infusion of the hand pump for access to drinking water. And in order to actually put in a hand pump, we brought in the technology of borewell in hard rock regions of India. Technology proliferates very rapidly. And the technology that came in for drinking water sourcing in the drought-prone regions of India quickly was taken up as technology that could access water for all regions. Urban, industrial, and moreover agriculture. As we deepened our existing wells and we drilled deeper through our boreholes, our groundwater extraction really grew. Around the 1980s and subsequently even in the 1990s, with the advent of electric pumps, especially with the advent of submersible pumps, people could actually drill deeper, put in pumps at whatever depth they wanted and extract water from greater and greater depths. So in some ways it was a race to drill deeper and a race to the pump house to almost install pumps of higher capacities and so on and so forth. So today India is perhaps the largest user of groundwater in the world, which is a well-known fact. But we also have the largest density of wells, so roughly 30 to 40 million wells in India. And we kind of have technologies that can access water from depths of thousands of feet, making it a very, very unique proposition.
So that was India's groundwater story, a very, very short synopsis of a story that can be made into a much, much longer film. But in some ways it encapsulates what I was saying, that after the 19th century, something changed. And the last 60 or 70 years in India makes India's own story very, very unique. So much so that, despite being a dam country, India has one of the largest number of dams in the world, our rural drinking water supply is almost entirely groundwater. 70% of water in agriculture comes from groundwater sources. 50% of urban water supply is groundwater based. And while we don't have significant figures on how much the industry uses, our own guess and our own estimates from different smaller studies indicate that, again, half of what industry gets, half of the water that industry uses comes from groundwater. Now, what is even more interesting is that the ecosystem in India, the natural system, the natural environment, also uses groundwater. And on the right-hand side, for example, this picture is a well constructed for tigers in the Nagzira Forest Reserve. And you have many such sources in different forestry regions of India. Why? Because the natural watering holes in many, many such regions, thickly forested regions, are running dry. So there is a groundwater depletion also in protected ecosystems, which has led to sourcing, artificial sourcing of groundwater for wildlife, just as human beings have done. And this doesn't necessarily get captured in the story. But all in all, what it means is 1 billion Indians, if you sort of do a quick back of the envelope calculation on this entire, the 4 points that I mentioned here, 1 billion Indians use groundwater every day in some way or the other, which means there's a huge demographic footprint around groundwater. And I think that is something that we need to take on board. Now, therefore, to summarize this, what changed after the 19th century? And what changed after the 19th century is a complete shift from common access to individual access. I would go on to say that privatized access through many types of holes in the ground. So we just punctured the ground with many holes, shallow, intermediate, deep, dug wells, bore wells, tube wells. The legal provisions notwithstanding. Second, we brought high-end pumps that were capable of extracting large volumes of water over short periods of time. So we redefined efficiency of water by saying that if you pull out a lot of water over a short period of time, it sort of comes very close to how efficiency is defined in the subject of physics. And so the access and extraction became very, very different from the legacy of the earlier period. Now, I want to show you two main graphics. One is, the next one is qualitative, this is quantitative. And I'm going to pick on two examples. One is in the last 50 years from the sort of video that I showed you. If you look at agriculture in India, agriculture itself has gone a sea of change. If you look at the red line is what is called nutri-cereals, and in simple terms, millets. Millets were dominant in India even at independence. You know, like in our region, jowar, bajra, or we have ragi in many parts of India. So different millets. And the millets, the area under millet cultivation went down. The area under all other crops went up, mainly paddy and wheat. So our diet changed, our production in agriculture changed, and this led to a consequence of, at independence, we were probably using around 800 billion cubic meters of water for crop production. Today, we use 1200 billion cubic meters of water for crop production. And these are very, very gross figures that my colleagues have actually estimated from various data sets. Now, a lot of this came from groundwater. I mean, it of course came from our irrigation systems like dams and reservoirs, but a significant part also came from groundwater, so much so that in the latter part, in the last 20-30 years, there was a dominance of groundwater over surface water as millions of farmers drilled wells into the ground. So, you know, the groundwater story does not stop only in terms of extraction. Give me a second, I'm just going to connect my laptop to power. So this is the story, the rural story, the agricultural story, that we brought in irrigated crops at the expense of more nutritious cereals. And therefore, I want to bring in the changing agroeconomy that demanded more water. And mind you, you can correlate this to whether it was the politics that drove the economy on one side, or the economy that drove the politics. Maybe in the earlier phases, it was really about food security, and politics was really about attaining food security. But progressively, it became about selling the produce, and it became more economics. And therefore, the political economy is also something which is very important. Now, the other case where political economy is important, I mean, apart from the fact that 400 billion cubic meters was added as crop water demand over a 66-year period, was the story of urban expansion. And I'm again going to show you a sort of quickly rolling graphic on how small towns situated in a rural hinterland like this, using shallow groundwater, morphed into the urban agglomerations that we live in today. And you'll see in the cartoon itself how things change. And one of the things which happened as a sort of part of this story was the natural areas which soak in water, which we in hydrogeological terms call natural recharge areas, got built upon. because nobody thought of them as natural recharge areas at that point in time. I mean, if I were to ask any of the audiences today that, let's say, India became the largest user of groundwater in the 1980s, and how were we thinking about groundwater in the 1980s? Whether the urban expansion in Mumbai or Pune really took into account these natural recharge areas? The answer is an obvious no. So these natural recharge areas got built upon as suburbs went into peri-urbs, and then the sort of hinterland sources dried up. So we drilled deeper, we got down the hole hammer drilling rigs. We put in more bore wells and tube wells instead of dug wells. Dug wells were still used. And therefore, we arrived at a point where even a city like Pune, for example, which formally receives about 15 TMC water from dams, is also using about 4 to 5 TMC of groundwater. And the groundwater story goes unnoticed. It's important to talk about all of these things because you keep asking me, okay, you're stating the problem. But if we have to get to solutions, we really have to understand what our problems are. So after having done this, again, a short video in terms of how does this whole story, for example, or part of the story gets reflected in a city. And this is a short video about Bangalore.
India is rapidly urbanizing. There are nearly 5,000 plus towns and cities in India. Civic water supplies simply fall short considering the very rapid rate of urbanization. So the gap between civic supplies and the demand is filled by groundwater. There is growing evidence now that nearly 50% of urban water supplies in India are groundwater based, informally or formally.
So what you see in the video is just the sheer number of tankers that form part of a city traffic in many summers. Now, this first part, and I have 3 parts to this presentation. I'm just going to summarize the first part. So this first part is about the paradox of growing dependencies and deepening vulnerability. So the growing demand on groundwater has serious implications on water security, on a national water security agenda. There's a conflict over here, and it's important to understand the sort of very dynamic, complex competition over groundwater, not just between one user and another, but between different types of users. Our solutions still, and largely, especially in the last 20 years, have been around improving access and distribution of water by increasing the number of sources. That's the reason why I often jokingly say that India's groundwater story is a sad story, because it continues to focus on sources, access, and distribution without a reference to what the resource is all about. Let's come to that in a moment. And just a quick, again, a very, very quick roll of the dice. Now, what is this vulnerability about? It is a 4-fold vulnerability. The first is groundwater depletion, falling water levels, wells going dry, but wells that actually go dry sometimes also represent a long legacy. So this well that I just showed you is a well here. This is from Nimrana in Alwar district of Rajasthan. And it had a very intricate system of access and management. Hello, I think somebody is speaking in the background. Can you mute yourself, please? Okay, so this is the sort of management. This doesn't represent architecture itself. It represents an entire groundwater management system. So when a well like that goes dry, it represents a loss of heritage. It's not just falling water levels, it's a loss of heritage. And when wells go dry, they actually indicate to you that it's depleting. What does a drying well mean? And therefore, it represents aquifers that are drying up, that have a story and a history. It also represents how going deeper as a consequence of drying up of shallow sources, when you go deeper, you are getting into a greater degree of privatization. So this is again from a village in Marathwada, from one of our projects, where you can see how dug well water use till the 1990s almost got converted into a dominant borewell water use as the shallow sources, the shallow aquifers dried up. It also represents that the ownership pattern, dug wells were more common dug wells. Borewells became more individualized and privatized. Now, the other thing that happened in the same village is dug wells, which tapped the shallow sources, which were often mechanisms of drought proofing, especially during poor rainfall years. 97% of the dug wells have become seasonal now. And farmers report that till about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, most of their dug wells were perennial, irrespective of what year it would be. And this is extremely important in the way we are going to manage our groundwater. It kind of brings us to that point where we need to think about what is it that we want to revive, what is it that we want to conserve. The second impact, so the first is depletion of wells, and part of that is depletion of mountain water and drying up of springs. There's of course a natural spring in Spiti Valley, where again we have worked for a long time, and it shows you how it just springs out of a mountain. It's one of the most fascinating pictures I have clicked about a spring. Completely dry landscape. It's a natural landscape. I mean, deserts are natural. Evergreen forests are natural. And I am not a great fan of greening the desert if the desert is a natural system. So these are dry, cold, arid regions of India, which hold a very different ecosystem value. Springs are part of that. And this is also an example of the underlying geology being the most important controlling factor on groundwater. It's really not anything on the surface of the earth, but what's beneath. So a lot of these springs are drying up. And when a spring dries up, you see that this is the discharge of a spring. It goes down. The drivers of depletion could be many things. They could be changing climate. It could be land cover, changing land use. It could be seismicity, earthquake hazards, many landslides, many aspects. But a significant part of this is anthropogeny. What is most important is that when a spring dries up in the mountain, it's actually the stocked up water inside the mountain that's depleting, which means the aquifer is drying up. So it's the depletion of the most reliable climate buffer in the mountains. So that's my second point. The third is in terms of water quality and contamination. And water quality and contamination has huge consequences on both human and animal health and well-being. So whether it's arsenic, fluoride, or high salinity, it leads to serious morbidity and sometimes to mortality too. And it causes both social and economic distress. Now, at a very conservative estimate, 25% of India's districts have become vulnerable to contamination. Let's go on. And this is again an example of what I was trying to say that we did with one of our partners, and all of this work I'm presenting is usually in partnership with some organization or the other. Out of 453 samples across, you can see those locations, those panchayats below, from 5 districts in North Bihar, 25% of the samples, and these are drinking water samples, mind you, had arsenic beyond the desirable limits. The next consequence is about ecosystems. And ecosystems and groundwater have a very intricate relationship that we still haven't really understood. I mean, we are just scratching the surface at this point in time. The base flow to a stream or a river, the non-monsoon dry season flow, is a consequence of groundwater or aquifers discharging their water to the rivers. Like this is a spring at the base of this mountain, and it is actually feeding the dry season flows of this river, again Spiti, where you see hundreds and thousands of such springs contributing to the river flow during the summer season. And therefore, when aquifers deplete, it leads to the drying up of rivers. And this is something we need to understand, that groundwater over extraction and groundwater depletion can lead to the drying up of rivers, and therefore groundwater depletion can actually affect ecosystems in a variety of ways, the most obvious being drying up of rivers. And I'll just go on. I mean, it's really about how much you pump and how the water levels goes down and how the river dries up. I'll come back to this if necessary. Therefore, at this point in time, and we probably have another 20 minutes before I finish, at this point in time, if I were to capture India's groundwater story, it's really about the tension between a growing dependency and a deepening vulnerability. But on the other hand, it's also a tension between two types of users. First is, for example, if you look at Eastern India, large parts of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, parts of West Bengal, parts of the northeastern region of India, it is marginal but crucial dependency. For example, a rain-fed farmer in Chhattisgarh who grows only one crop will still have a small, shallow well for meeting his on-the-farm needs, drinking water, ablution, those kinds of needs. And on the other hand, you have regions where farmers have pumped heavily on their farms, and progressively their sources are now part of the river channel itself, where you see these innumerable wells that they take water from the well, from the riverbed, and pump it out to the farms which don't have water. So it's really a question of the marginal but crucial dependency versus overexploitation and contamination. And therefore, the fact that we keep on increasing sources is important for us to understand aquifers. And this is just a brief introduction, a video introduction to what is the meaning of aquifers.
Surface water is essentially flow. We construct reservoirs, dams, artificial lakes to convert that flow into stocks. Once water percolates in or infiltrates into the ground and becomes groundwater, it gets stored in openings or spaces within rocks and material derived from rocks. Once water enters the matrix of rocks or the open matrix of rocks, it slows down and it essentially becomes more of stock than flows. Groundwater also flows, but it depends on the properties of rocks.
Therefore, first and foremost, in any response to the crisis of groundwater, to bring in and improve water security to both our rural and urban regions, we must focus on aquifers. Aquifers must become the focus of any effort at groundwater management and governance. Because when we talk of rivers, we talk of river basins. When we talk of smaller catchments, we talk of watersheds. But when we talk of groundwater, why don't we talk of aquifers as easily as we talk of river basins and watersheds? And I think that is the big paradox that is staring us in the face when we deal with water management in India. So aquifers must become the focus of groundwater management. And I'll just show you the meaning of So aquifers are, well, 3 or 4 things. First and foremost, they are a rock formation, either a rock or material derived from rock like sand, silt, and gravel. It's saturated with water. That material or the rock has to be saturated with water. It must be able to both store and transmit certain amounts of water to different sources, such as springs and wells. So this is, for example, a high altitude spring in North Sikkim, and it's giving out 50 liters per minute. And 50 liters per minute, even on an average, means 26,000 cubic meters in a year, which means that if the spring has to give 50 liters per minute, there has to be a sufficiently large amount of water stored in this rock matrix, maybe about 100,000 cubic meters of water. Only then can it give you 26,000 cubic meters in a year. And that is the more or less common man's understanding of groundwater or of aquifers. Now we must also remember that aquifers or groundwater is a part of the larger hydrological cycle that we all know. But very often in the pursuit of the larger holistic picture, we tend to forget this picture of aquifers. And it tends to get hidden over what is visible because groundwater is invisible. So making aquifers as a part of, it being a part of the larger water cycle and trying to understand how water behaves in an aquifer becomes equally important. Now, in order to understand aquifers, like I showed you this map before, India is a very, very aquifer diverse country because it has 80–85% of all global rock types can be found in India. And I don't want you to read through this in detail, but each of these regions has a peculiar aquifer setting. And you have to understand that setting if you're going about trying to manage or trying to design a management plan anywhere in this region. So what you would do in the green and what you would do in the blue or the yellow would be very different in terms of management. There would be a commonality in the process of understanding aquifers, but in terms of just the stocks of water, the nature of groundwater flow, all of that would vary significantly across this aquifer typology. Now, if we compare, and this is the Central Groundwater Board's latest groundwater assessment for India, if we actually compare all this, these two maps, then you'll find that this has been the major focus of groundwater overexploitation in India. Similarly, there's another very large focus in peninsular South India. But as you can see, things are evolving into overexploitation in the central part, Madhya Pradesh, large parts of Maharashtra, and extending into Marathwada, and then into Telangana, and then of course into Telangana here, into northern Karnataka, and then sort of this particular region where Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and part of Kerala actually come together. And you can see therefore that here it is largely in the pink, here it is a mixed bag, but again, largely in the yellow. So the nature of overexploitation is going to be very, very different when you look at this versus this. The other thing I want to show you is just the distribution of these settings. And as you can see, the dominant is the pink and the green, the pink and the yellow. The pink and the yellow show extremely contrasting properties of aquifers, and therefore they have very different behavior of groundwater, if I may call that so. Similarly, what we did was a couple of years ago, we also came up with how are the rural and the urban, this is the urban and the rural habitations in India distributed across these settings. So how many urban centers or how many towns and cities are located in the alluvial terrain. So for example, 3,131 versus how many are located in the crystalline terrain, 1,887. And therefore, as you can see that, you can almost say that alluvial is definitely more. Similarly, there are more villages in the alluvial than in the crystalline, and so on and so forth. So it's a typology-based, an aquifer typology-based distribution of urban and rural habitations. And this helps us understand, also sort of the degree of urbanization in different aquifer typologies. Sorry. Okay. Now, if I were to just represent this typology in a cartoon like this, and a cartoon of diverse set of aquifer systems. So for example, this is the volcanic, which we are sitting on in Mumbai and Pune. This is the alluvium, the yellow that I showed you. This is the Himalayan mountain region. This is the pink, the crystalline region, largely South India, Eastern India. This is central region, consolidated sediment. But there are also transition typologies like the Tarai region between the Himalayan landscape and the Indo-Gangetic plain, which is called the Tarai. And it sits on a transition region between a mountainous system and an alluvial system. And it poses a very different set of properties, but also a set of challenges. Now, let me sort of quickly come to the urban a bit. And it's interesting that in the urban, and this is something that I compiled just yesterday, if you look at the annual demand, if you compute in urban India, if you compute the annual demand at an average 150 liter per capita per day, and look at the long-term average annual rainfall in major cities, as I've listed here, then you can see that the annual demand for water in some cases like Delhi exceeds the annual rainfall. And in fact, in many of the cities, the annual demand constitutes more than either 50 or more than 50% of the rainfall. So if the rainfall fails, it has happened over the last decade or so, if there's a rainfall shortage, then your annual demand and the rainfall for that year actually come close to each other, which means that your carrying capacity, your natural carrying capacity for that point has already been exceeded. So this is an interesting graphic that points us to the fact that in urban India, again, given that groundwater occupies the space between supply and availability, or supply and usage, we must try and understand what our groundwater availability is. And in order to do that, I'm sort of also very quickly taking you through a process. Understanding aquifers requires an understanding of the underlying geology. That's the first and foremost thing. So that constitutes the fundamental science of understanding groundwater. So we've done something similar for Pune city, the detailed geological map of Pune city, on the basis of which we arrived at an aquifer map for Pune city, on the basis of which, and there were many, many more things between these two, but on the basis of this, we also arrived at what is called an aquifer recharge area map. So, you see these bluish shades, they represent the aquifer recharge areas for Pune city. These are the watersheds. So there are something like 29 or 30 watersheds that bring water into Pune city. Now, I'm just going to show you again a quick animation of how the city has grown over the last 100 years. Take a look at it. This was probably 1920. This was around 1960, maybe around 1990, and 2020. So in the last 100 years, nearly all the recharge areas have been built upon. Nearly all the surface water catchments have been built upon. And it's therefore important to also bring in a systematic urban recharge program, keeping in mind the aquifers, keeping in mind the aquifer recharge areas, and then move forward in terms of how you use the science. And that's where I want to bring in the concept of rainwater harvesting linked to water sources. It's not new. I mean, it goes back to Dholavira. There's a well. There are rainwater harvesting structures even in the archaeological site of Dholavira. And there are umpteen examples of these traditional conservation mechanisms from different parts of India. And these have been well documented. Now, I call the sort of the groundwater situation in urban India as a zero-sum game. And I'll tell you very quickly why I call it that. I call it that simply because as urban space develops, as sort of the surface of the earth gets built upon, two things happen. First is there is a reduction in surfaces that induce infiltration of rainwater. Second, as old pipes decay, there's a lot of leakage. There's a lot of leakage through water supply systems. There's a lot of leakage through sewers. Where does the leaked water end up? The leaked water actually ends up first in the aquifers because your pipes are in closest proximity to the aquifers. Okay? And therefore, very often in large parts of India, you see, takes a little time to load. You see that the drop in natural groundwater recharge remains hidden behind the leaking, behind the leakage. And it leads to a zero-sum game. It almost leads to an impression that, well, all is well. You know, our wells are not drying up. Like it happens unlike in rural areas where you see the obvious. And I think that paradox leads us to taking up certain measures. Therefore, in summary of this section, and the last section is a much shorter section, aquifers are the real resource that is part of the larger water system. We must bring our focus down to aquifers. Aquifers represent a common pool resource. They are common to all. What is available to you is a consequence of what has happened as recharge in somebody else's land. The science of aquifers is important, and the science of aquifers is not just technical, it's developing transdisciplinary and demystified knowledge and data. Sorry, the TA is gone missing. And all of this must lead to decision and action. So science must become highly democratized so that people are able to take common decisions and are able to act in a manner that is equitable, efficient, and sustainable. Therefore, when an aquifer depletes, and mind you, right now, I'm also showing you a graphic which shows you that when an aquifer depletes, you often talk about what's going in and what's coming out. And look at number 2 and number 8. What goes in and what comes out is similar. So if you just look at what's being taken out and the recharge, you have a somewhat skewed understanding of what's happening below the ground. Because you might be prone to saying that, okay, this and this is similar, so we'll have a similar set of responses to the problem. But when you open your eyes to the aquifer below, you might actually find something like this. That this is either one aquifer which has depleted over, say, 10 years, 15 years, or it could be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, different aquifers in different states of exploitation in different parts of an area or a country. But what I'm trying to tell you now is that when you look at a system like this, and this is from an old project, it was an international project that we were part of, and we were looking at aquifers in India. And therefore, an aquifer is not just about recharge, extraction, or storage. It has many dimensions. For example, when an aquifer depletes, it's not just about how the extraction goes up and comes down. It's also about how the size of the water-related economy changes. It's also about the energy demand. And when you, for example, in a situation like this, if it takes 1 unit of energy to extract groundwater, 1 unit of groundwater in A, it probably takes 10 units of energy to extract 1 unit of groundwater in H. And that's something we need to remember. Then the next one is about the social context, that if this is, for example, providing water for drinking, then the drinking water security drops as the aquifer depletes. Very often when an aquifer depletes, the water quality drops. And therefore it's a double whammy that hits you when an aquifer drops, so your water quality drops as well. And last but not least, the base flow contribution, aquifers contributing water to rivers and streams, also goes down as a consequence of aquifer depletion. So an aquifer depletion, or the consequences of aquifer depletion, are social, economic, and ecological. And when you therefore try and reimagine the restoration and management and governance of this aquifer, you are posed with three major questions: the question of equity, the question of efficiency, and the question of sustainability. So when you take up groundwater recharge, it must be based on the tenet of not just pushing water into the ground through a pipe, but changing that to recharge as the addition of groundwater to the existing storage in the aquifer. And there are various mechanisms. I'm going to sort of brush through these very quickly. These are, you could either construct dams. So rather than calling it groundwater recharge, the international practice nowadays is to call it managed aquifer recharge. And this is, of course, a graphic developed by CSIRO Australia. And it talks about a whole process of recharge. Similarly, when we, for example, use something like this, we actually use the geology in a watershed to put our recharge structure. So if your aquifers are somewhere there, your recharge structures have to be put there. You can't simply put them anywhere. It's just an example of how the concept of managed aquifer recharge is used. Similarly, in the urban space, when you look at rainwater harvesting, it requires an intricate set of procedures, and also how you recover that water, what is the quality of that water. It becomes an entire process. And therefore, when we use recharge as a means of restoration, for example, in areas like, for example, one of our major focus areas at ACWADAM has been the revival of springs in the mountains. And we have partnered with many organizations. We have also been writing up for the Government of India on what is called a spring shed management approach, which is nothing but a transdisciplinary approach that weaves in the hydrogeology, society in terms of villages, how the villages share their water underneath, putting in recharge at the right place, and also putting in recharge in the right manner so that both quantities and quality of water is sustained, and getting people to come together to manage a complex, invisible, hidden, dynamic resource like groundwater. And that kind of sums up the focus of the process that we follow in reviving groundwater. Towards the end, and just again a quick set of slides, I would like to spend a minute each on these two slides. If you want to manage water, you need to quantify it. Similarly, if you want to manage water in an aquifer, you need to quantify it. And there are actually three dimensions of that quantification. Quantifying demand, what is used or what is needed or what is demanded. Quantifying availability, how much of water in the aquifer. And then how do you supply that water efficiently, which is really about technology, engineering, and so on and so forth, but also about regulating that supply. So let's take an average Indian village, and with those matrices, 500 hectares agriculture, 1,000 hectares of area, 100 households, 500 people. The annual demand typically, with a typical set of crops, and of course this will change from village to village, but on an average is 528 millimeters. Now what is interesting is that the drinking and domestic water demand in a typical Indian village, when you convert liters or cubic meters over that area of the village, it is 2 millimeters per year. It's a very, very small demand. But it actually becomes sensitive to the other demands. Okay, and the other demands become sensitive to how much a typical basalt aquifer, for example, in a village can store, because a basalt aquifer in a typical typical basalt village can store about 100 millimeters of water against 528 annual demand. So one aquifer can store about 100 millimeters of water. In the alluvial aquifer, in the Indo-Gangetic plain, for example, one aquifer can store about 1000 millimeters of water. So this contrast is very interesting. And therefore, having a demand like this over a basalt aquifer is going to be unsustainable. So that is the big point in the approach that we adopt. Now, you contrast this with the demand in an urban area. And then again, if you take an urban area which has a population density of 100 persons per hectare of land, you see a completely different demand pie. Here, for example, the domestic demand, including drinking water, dominates against the agricultural demand in a typical Indian village. And you now are looking at 712 millimeters per annum. Bring back the basalt and the alluvial aquifer. Even with the alluvial aquifer, you are now reaching the sort of margins or the boundaries of what is available. And bringing these things into one place becomes equally important. So, rural versus urban. Now, typically when we work in large parts of India, our focus, apart from many other things we do, is to do a groundwater balance. And a groundwater balance, for instance, points us to how much is the optimum availability of an aquifer. It depends on the underlying geology. So for example, one aquifer is able to hold 400 millimeters of water, large storage, whereas another might actually hold only about 50 or 60 millimeters of water. And then against that, you begin to look at, okay, during one particular year, let's say 2018-19, how much was the extraction? And you convert that to millimeters, and you can almost see how much of the aquifer storage was used during that year. You can do something similar with recharge, and you can see how much was recharged. So quantifying and also bringing in quality. I've not really touched upon quality so much, but we do a lot of work on groundwater quality monitoring as well, apart from quantification. Last but not least, there are broadly 5 or 6 mechanisms or normative points that you can take up. Don't bother too much about the matrix. Just look at this. First, you need the science. Second, you need protection and conservation at the right place. Third, you need to use your sources very efficiently. Fourth, you need to also decide at what rate you're going to pump your water. The rate at which you pump should not be decided by how much water you want. It should be decided by what is the sustainable yield that the aquifer can provide to your well or spring or to your source. Fifth, the distance, how close two wells should be, because one well is going to interfere with the other, and it becomes a very inefficient system if two wells begin to interfere with each other. Sixth, what is the depth at which extraction is sustainable, and what is the depth beyond which extraction becomes unsustainable? Seventh, how do you regulate water for agriculture use? How do you regulate water for industrial or urban use? And last but not least, getting people to come together and in some way share their groundwater. Because managing aquifers as common pool resources requires people to come together and share their water. It is going to be extremely challenging, but it is actually extremely, I would say it's very necessary at the moment if we are to look at the canvas of the groundwater crisis in India. Last but not least, therefore, and in summary, I would look at managing groundwater in India, whether it is urban or rural, through the 5 Ps. It's about peoples, it's about principles, processes, practices, and policies. values and norms in the context of scale and diversity becomes important. Social norms must be constituted before we come into formal legislation. Replace command and control with cooperative systems of management. There are, of course, the undercurrents of ownerships and rights. And even as we talk today, we see that caste and gender forms a great division in the social fabric of India, despite the great strides we have made in so-called development. Last but not least, there are the marginalized even in groundwater. And I can cite umpteen examples on the fact that the reason we understand aquifers, or the reason why we should understand aquifers, is also to understand the marginalization. You can understand marginalization in society better if you start understanding aquifers. And of course, there's the broader political economy, which I believe at the moment completely ignores, nearly completely ignores the science of groundwater. And we cannot brush it off by saying that it's an externality that we can continue to ignore in the space of groundwater management. So in the urban space, mapping, management, and governance, mapping becomes something you can almost undertake through a voluntary effort. Management is more strategic, designed to specific locations and done through a systematic process. And governance is where people and policy come together. I will probably stop with that by saying that look at groundwater as a local resource. Look at community participation through any means that one can imagine. And in the whole process of governance, look at the principle of public trust to manage and govern groundwater resources in India. I will leave you with that slide. And sorry for exceeding the time by, I was given an hour. I think I took 7 or 8 minutes more than that. So thank you once again, and I'll come back with you. I'll stop sharing and get back to the chat. Yes, over to you, Kirti.
Hello, sir. So most of the questions have been answered by Neha and Uma. Just I will go through the few unanswered questions. So Dr. Shevde, should I?
Before you actually go to the question,
Yes.
I think we will allow just a few moments for the participants to get out of this brilliant journey that Dr. Kulkarni just took us with on groundwater. आपण एक थोडासा वेळ त्यांना सगळ्यांना देऊया. अनफॉर्च्युनेटली अशा प्रेझेंटेशनच्या नंतर टाळ्यांचा कडकडाट झाला पाहिजे. तो ऐकू जाणार नाहीये, पण आय एम शुअर ऑल द पार्टिसिपेंट्स विल पुट देयर
और उमा बोला ना, वो टीचर्स थी, नेहा में तो को बोला था ना,
they will put their reactions, and we need to really thank you for such a brilliant presentation and such an insightful presentation into this topic that you dealt with today. Now, Kirti, my request to you is please take up the questions.
Yes. Yes. So one question from Mr. Ravi is why Bid faces perennial drought every year and nothing is being done to find permanent solution?
Okay, yeah, I mean, we've been working in some of the regions in Marathwada, and it is interesting because, like I said, the marginalization of the margins I've been talking to, and you could imagine the marginalization of margins in very different ways. And it's not just Bid, it's Bid, Usmanabad, parts of Latur, they all face the same crisis. So for one, I think it is because there is very little support in terms of surface water. Second, it's looked upon as a rain-fed area. You know, because there's no formal irrigation system in these regions. It's looked upon as an area which has no irrigation, and therefore it is classified as rain-fed. And my colleague Uma, who's working in that area, who's leading our program in that area, has always been telling us, and we've done some, in the villages that we work, and there are scores of them, we find that there are villages which have 2,000 borewells. And it's classified as a rain-fed area where there are 2,000 borewells. There is absolutely no direction. Honestly, there's no direction to the community in terms of what should be done. So we've lost out on at least 2 decades in these regions in terms of providing the right inputs and the right kind of both inputs in terms of both, economic inputs, social inputs, but also in terms of scientific inputs. And it is not only a met drought, but it is also a groundwater drought. It's one of the most seriously groundwater exploited regions of India, I would say. It's not as reflected as some of the other regions, but it still is as serious as that. And I think the way to go about that is to come up with a very different set of policies, to come up with a very different set of, incentives, even incentives, market incentives for completely changing the agricultural systems that Marathwada was so very famous for. And I talked of nutri-cereals. It's a region of nutri-cereals. And you see how much it has changed in terms of cropping systems just over the last decade or so. So I think many things, but this is a broad canvas that I can refer to at the moment.
Yes, the next question is from Brajesh Tomar. He is asking how to identify spring-shed drainage systems.
We've been working with this organization in Nepal called ECMOD. And we've developed a manual. It's a very, very detailed manual, which looks at a 6-step protocol to reviving springs in the mountains. It's mainly focused on the Himalayan region, but the broad contours of the manual can be applied to any region in India.
Okay, Shailesh is asking.
Sorry, Kirti, let me just sort of on a lighter note.
Yes.
I'm sure many of you live in Mumbai, and I would urge you, I don't know, I haven't been there for a long time, where the Meethi actually meets the sea. There's a rocky region there, okay? And I remember as a child, my grandparents lived in Mumbai, so I spent a lot of my summers in Mumbai. We used to go to that point, and there was a freshwater spring where the Meethi meets the sea. There was a freshwater spring. You could actually take the water and, drink it, take it in your mouth, and you would find it was sweet water. I don't know what's happened to that spring. So right bang at, it's not just the mountains. You can actually get springs even in regions of delta. And that spring in Meethi is one example.
Thank you for the wonderful memory, sir. So now Shailesh is asking, is there any government plan on groundwater management, and is it really working as per the plan? So government's work on groundwater, I think he want to ask.
Well, it does. One of the first big programs on groundwater, well, there are 2 actually, was on large-scale recharge. They called it artificial recharge. And then subsequently in 2010, at the behest of the Planning Commission, I was chairing this Committee on Sustainable Groundwater Management. And with the help of the CGWB, we were able to come up with the Aquifer Mapping Plan for India, which has progressed significantly. But I think there's still a gap between creating a map, mapping an area, and creating a set of actions that will change the situation on the ground. And I think that is what we need to work on more. And unless and until there are partnerships that are built with the government, or partnerships with communities, partnerships with between civil society and academia, I think this will not move ahead. I think the key is really partnerships, converting good science into demystified communication, into community level decision making, into an actionable agenda. I think that's the way to go.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. Uh, just a small little, you mentioned Mithi River, and my request to you is please do not visit the Mithi River today. You'll have a very rude shock, which is very unfortunate. But while talking about, there was some mention about traditional wisdom and the relevance of, you had a slide wherein you showed 1,000-year-old technology at work. So
Yes.
there was one question about the relevance of that kind of traditional wisdom in the present times. And as an extension, the other part, I would put it as what would be my responsibility as an urban dweller to the concept or to the reality of groundwater?
Okay, so I'll probably break my responses into three parts.
Yeah.
The first is on traditional, and one of the reasons I showed this slide. I mean, I actually have a 1-hour presentation only on the ethnography of groundwater. So as a part of that, I often say that if you look at the old mechanisms, for example, springs, access to springs in the mountains, and not just in the Himalayan region, but one of my other colleagues, Siddharth, is working with, or Neha, they've handled our projects in Eastern India, largely tribal dominated regions. And we have a very significant program that began 2 years ago in parts of Odisha, where we are looking at reviving some traditional springs. Now, what is interesting is the way these springs are accessed, the way water is divided in the community in terms of equal division. So if you look at tribal communities in India, across India, the question of equality, if you really want to study equality, you have to go and live with the tribals, because the tribals really know what equality is. Of course, that is progressively being eroded by modern society, but that's where you see a lot of that. The second element is, I think, traditional knowledge has a clear link to modern science. It's really about finding that link. For
Excellent.
instance, if you look at the Rehet or the moat that was operated in Maharashtra, what is it? It is really about a sustainable extraction of groundwater. So when we migrated, so effectively, if you were to design a Rehet or a moat, it requires very, very intricate science. And I have actually found very little evidence. I have found a lot of evidence of the technology, on the technology side. But on the science side, I have found very little evidence on why these technologies survived for hundreds of years. One of the reasons is that when you design a Rehet, you have to design it in such a way that you know precisely the quantum of water that the aquifer will give to the well. If you know that quantum, you design the Rehet in such a way that it has, say, 20 buckets. 20 buckets at the rate of 1 revolution of the bullock, 1 bullock, will take out only that much amount of water that the aquifer is providing the well. When we installed modern pumps, did we actually bring in that whole science, or did we just say that कुआं है उसमें से ज्यादा पानी निकालना है तो 1 HP मत लगाओ 5 HP लगाओ, कम समय में पानी सब निकाल सकते हम, then we can go to a movie or go somewhere else and enjoy ourselves. I think this is the dichotomy of traditional wisdom and modern science. And I think your last point, what was that? Can you just remind me?
As an urban dweller, as most of us are,
Yes.
how would I perceive groundwater and what would be my responsibility towards it? Or is it, should I rephrase?
I think it's one single. No. I'll answer that, Doc. I think I'll tell you why it's difficult. Because for me, the perception of individual responsibility to groundwater becomes a little skewed. I mean, at most, what I can do is manage my water properly, use less water and so on and so forth as an individual. But I think as an individual, if I can become, say, a volunteer in developing science, data, knowledge, that contributes. If I can begin to communicate the science of aquifers, the importance of a common pool resource, and the importance of coming together and sharing, that becomes the second responsibility. And the third is a little more intricate, that when the numbers of such individuals grow and these numbers become informal cooperatives, and those cooperatives start talking to each other, I think only then and only then will the picture really change, at least in urban India. In rural, it's perhaps a little easier to do because the responsibilities are direct. Each one has a well. How do I use my well? You can actually put in that individual responsibility. But in terms of the urban, unless the individual becomes a part of a larger group or a cooperative, I think it's very difficult to talk about a responsible groundwater citizen.
I think you have expressed it perfectly. I think this was a kind of a carry forward from our earlier webinar on water footprints, wherein the consensus was that we are just looking at it as a commodity to be had and to be used without any responsibility. So I guess the kind of element that you put in and you bring in of responsibility towards the consumption, I think is a very important beginning point. And you have just started a group of such individuals who would definitely start looking at this responsibility pretty seriously and hopefully initiate some kind of a communication. It will be also beneficial if you do let us know about the kind of programs or the courses that you conduct. So those who are a little more seriously inclined or would be inclined, I think they would be very happy to participate and join. This is my request to you.
Yeah.
And you can now move to the next questions. Yeah, sorry, you were saying something.
No, I was just saying something that I think we will keep you posted on the courses and as they happen. So we have essentially three types of courses, very briefly. First is a course for organizations where organizations send their representatives. So it's called the Foundation Course on Groundwater. The second is a course on groundwater governance. So usually we encourage people who have attended our foundation course to take the course on groundwater governance. And then we have more thematic or geographical courses. We are actually beginning this year. We are beginning a course on managing urban groundwater. We will focus by beginning with groundwater. And then we're also talking to some other partner organizations to look at a more sort of broader canvas of urban water management. And that will also be a part of the whole course. I would, also I was sort of browsing the chat box. And if you may permit me, I would want to address two questions. Hello? Yeah, so two questions. One I think is from Himali, which which is perhaps a more convenient question for me to answer at the moment because we do precisely that. So, going from science to communication, using local level participation, doing some basic training in a village, going from local level participation. So collection of data, for example, is one of the most fascinating means of indulging in participation or getting participation to begin with. Then using the same data that is collected by people on the ground to talk to communities, to talk to panchayats, so that they are able to take certain decisions. And we use the principle of democracy in doing that we don't necessarily impose our ideas or the results of our ideas on communities. And I think very often communities take up the suboptimal elements of the science, but it's important to keep communicating with communities to ensure the transition from competition to cooperation. I mean, that is in a sense the way we work on that. The second question was on Pani Panchayats, and it stirred a certain emotion because when I started out as a very young researcher in the early 80s, my PhD guru took me to Vilasrao Salunke first. My first field visit was to the Pani Panchayats in Purandar. And I believe the Pani Panchayats in Purandar have really set the scene for the phenomenal work that happened across the world late in the 90s. The whole concept of common pool resources was something that Vilasrao Salunke used in his quest to design a perfect water management system. I think the biggest contribution of the Pani Panchayat to society, whether they work or not right now is a different matter, but the biggest contribution was the contribution of delinking of land and water rights. I don't think there is any other example of that kind anywhere in the world where for 35 years, the Pani Panchayat functioned on the principle of delinked land and water rights. There was an equitable allocation of a water right to every single person. And whether he was a landed person, a marginal farmer, or a landless person, the water right was clearly there. And therefore, that whole process was a seminal example or illustration of managing demand and supply together, of managing water as a common pool resource. And in fact, a lot of the work that we do is designed on more intricate science embedded into the principles of Pani Panchayats. That's how I would define our work.
Anymore, Kirti, you can take up the next questions.
Yes, sir. So Kathy is asking us, just a minute, I'm scrolling to the chat box. So Kathy has asked, what can be done when the capacity of the aquifer have been reduced, and even when recharged due to the mining, the water holding capacity has been drastically depleted. So in such scenario, what could be the solution?
It's difficult to say, but I think it's more, so very often your science has to change hats. Like the clown in a circus. Think about the science as a clown in a circus who keeps changing hats. So the science is going to remain the same. Your understanding of aquifers is going to remain the same. But the way you communicate to different people has to be different. So sometimes it has to be, convincing. Sometimes it has to be cajoling. Sometimes it has to be threatening. And I think in terms of disruptions, if, for example, take the case of rivers. If you look at rivers and the river revival program in India, there are 2 or 3 types of players. One is a set of activists, who do narabaji and get their things done. Another is a set of people who run to the court. So whether it's the Supreme Court, or whether it's the local courts, or whether it's courts that deal with the environment. So it's a different set of people. Similarly, with different sets of problems, you use the same science through different means. Normally, your first step should be communication, and it should solve the problem. But I don't think we have really paid attention in our policy to the disruption of aquifers caused by excavation, any kind of excavation. I don't necessarily mean mining and minerals. I can also talk about the river deepening programs, which I detest, because a river, for example, in large parts of Maharashtra, when a river meanders, when you get a meander in Maharashtra, it has taken at least 60 million years for that meander to develop. It's a much, much longer heritage. It far precedes humans. It far precedes the modern animal and the flora and fauna. And just because of a program that talks about if you straighten a river, if you deepen it, if you widen it, your recharge will increase, your water management will assume some good form, you destroy a meander. The destruction of a meander is as bad as the sort of excavation of a mine. But because these are sort of looked at in two different ways on two different planes, it's also very, the responses are also very, very iniquitous. And I think dealing with that iniquity not only poses a challenge, but it also sort of highlights the importance of why you need different ways in dealing with different problems.
Thank you, sir. So Poonam is asking us for many government and private projects, it is mandatory to use groundwater with the permission of Central Groundwater Board. Is it helping in conservation of groundwater when this permission is given and the project is done?
Well, I would say yes and no. I think we need regulation, we need legislation, and in fact, the Central Groundwater Authority has come up with a new legislation right now. I don't know if you know, but there's a new legislation, and therefore, whether it's helping or not, I don't know, because at least it puts a certain set of norms into place. So the normative framework around the legislation is good enough, but I am not too sure about how effectively it is implemented. And there are larger legal problems or legislation problems around many such provisions.
Thank you, sir. So Sina Bhagat is asking, Sahyadri and Tamini area near Pune are biodiversity hotspot zones, and what should be the approach towards water management system in such areas where there is high rainfall? These are high rainfall zones.
Yeah. So see, I think, again, groundwater is full of paradoxes. I often say this in many of my talks. And one of the most common paradoxes is the relationship between rainfall and groundwater storage. As sort of ordinary mortals, we often feel that when it rains more, there's more groundwater, or where it rains more, there's more groundwater. But the amount of groundwater available is a function of the aquifer. Period. You might have large stocks, you can have large stocks of groundwater underneath desert areas, simply because they are very, very prolific aquifers which have taken rain over many centuries, collected it and stored it there. And you might have high rainfall areas, Cherrapunji, for example, or the Western Ghats, which the Western Ghats, especially in many parts, have a basalt rock underneath, and which has very poor groundwater storage capacities. And therefore, it's really important to understand that. One of the elements I didn't cover was the element of ecosystems and groundwater. And I think it's important for us to also explore a little more carefully what is the real relationship between different ecosystems and groundwater. So a forest ecosystem in the Western Ghats and a forest ecosystem in the Himalayas have two different implications to the underground water. But there's very little research on this.
I think that takes care about almost all the questions which have been put up. In case there is anything further which does come up, we will share it with you, and I'm sure it can be addressed via the email. And a lot of questions got answered directly in the chat, and I was wondering about Neha and Siddharth. I think we must also thank Neha and Siddharth for effectively taking care of a lot of these questions right during and along the course of the presentation. And I believe they are your colleagues and working with you.
Yeah. So Neha, so my senior most colleague Uma is also here. I think she
Right,
wants to
Uma.
answer a couple of questions.
Yes.
Then Neha, Siddharth, and Neha, and Manoj, who works very closely with me on the urban groundwater side, is also here. So we have a team. We have a very active team. In fact, I'm just the face of the organization. I think there's more work at the back end than at the front end, and therefore like I said right at the beginning, I said the presentation was really a reflection of all that work by my colleagues.
Excellent, and that is how things should be. And perhaps a big thank you and a big applause to the face and also the people behind this particular work. Please thank them profusely on our behalf. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Are there any more questions which have come up, or are we coming to a conclusion? But how I would
Yes,
look at it is that we would look at.
इससे काम चला लो.
Sorry.
इससे.
Someone has unmuted, I think. So Srinivasa sir has asked, he want to speak something.
Yes.
मतलब वो आएगी तो फिर आपको दे देगी चेट होल्ड कर सकते हैं.
Thank you very much, Kirtivani.
ठीक है.
The water resources are presented in terms of in terms of quantity and all that, and maximum water is contributed for the rainfall is ocean waters. Ocean waters are very saltish, and it requires a lot of energy for evaporation for the formation of rainwater clouds. Okay. Instead, when you increase the biodiversity across the country, they will be very, very efficient in supplying water for the rainwater clouds formation. And we get rains more in quantity than what it is. In fact, by default, we need to complement COVID for its maximum amount of rainfall this year. When you take the statistics, you will understand quantity across India of the rainfall is maximum as compared to the last years. Why? Because pollution is significantly reduced, particularly vehicular pollution. So in this way, my only appeal is let us use the plants and biodiversity extent both in density and distribution and diversity for the water supply for the cloud formation. Once the rainwater clouds are there, we are going to get rain very easily. It is a relatively less energy intensive process. Transpiration, all of you are very familiar with that. Transpiration, by which the plants would supply water for the formation of clouds. It is necessary in India definitely to explore that possibility of rainfall through plants.
In some, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Reddy, for your inputs and even the other input on the wild flowers or the weeds that you mentioned in your chat. Thank you so much. Thank you for having joined us for this particular session, and hope to see you again.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm obligated to do that.
So I believe this sort of sums up the morning's or the afternoon's proceedings.
Yeah.
Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, on behalf of all of us at Vivant Foundation, and I'm sure on behalf of all the participants, Here's a very big thank you to you and your colleagues for this excellent, insightful presentation. I'm sure a lot of us would want to join up to know more about groundwater via your courses. And we will be happy to share the information with the participants. We'll also share the feedback with you, and people can get in touch with you directly